I'm Alison Purgiel with the Muskegon Area District Library. Thank you for joining us for a RootTALK session about naturalization records. We will be discussing how your ancestors became citizens of the United States, the kinds of records they generated when they did so, and what information those records contain. Then we'll jump online to review some tips on searching for U.S. naturalization records on two genealogy megasites, Ancestry Library Edition and MyHeritage Library Edition. I'm so glad you can join us. Let's get started. What is naturalization? Well, it's the process where someone who has immigrated to a foreign country, in this case, somebody came to the United States and they wish to become a citizen and have all the rights and privileges of being a citizen in that country. In the United States, the Naturalization Act of 1802 established the two-part naturalization process, which basically remains in effect today. Now, naturalization records can be a great source of genealogical information, but to be honest, it really depends on when the naturalization process took place. We'll talk more specifically about what information is provided and where that can lead you on your genealogy search when we look at specific records further on in the class. Also, naturalization records are a record source that can date back to the 1790s. For the state of Michigan, state court records primarily cover the 1850s through the 1960s. It's really helpful to think of the process of naturalization, of applying for citizenship in the United States, as occurring in two different historical time periods. It's basically pre-1906 versus post-1906. And that's what's going to make the big difference in what information you get on a naturalization application. The Naturalization Act of 1906 instituted some really big changes in the process, including asking for a lot more detailed information of applicants. We'll learn more about this as we continue on in the session today, but the good news is that just because your ancestor may have arrived in the 19th century, it doesn't mean that they didn't get involved in the naturalization process until after 1906. So just because you might have early arrivals, you don't want to give up on looking for citizenship papers because you still may find something of interest if they did it before 1906. And if they came in 1881, but they waited until after 1906 to complete their process, which they certainly could do, you might get really lucky and find some great information. So today's session, we're first going to cover the naturalization process and what it looked like pre-1906 and what it looks like post-1906. Then we're going to take a look at some search strategies to find naturalization records, because it will be important to know that as a lot of these records have not been digitized. They're not something like the census records where lots of them or all of them have been digitized and are available online. So it's going to be sometimes take a little detective work to find out where the naturalization records for your family member might be located. So the U.S. naturalization process pre-1906. First of all, the U.S. Constitution was ratified in 1788. We've talked about this before in other RootTALK sessions because it gave Congress a lot of powers, including the power to naturalize aliens who lived in the country. So the Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution enumerates or lists all those powers, and it includes the power to establish a uniform rule of naturalization. Congress was given the job, figure out how you're going to make people become citizens of the United States and have all the rights and privileges thereof. Well, first of all, right off the bat, Congress granted a blanket naturalization for basically all the white males who were living in the country at this time. So if you were in the United States by 1788 and prior, and you were a white male, you were automatically granted citizenship through this blanket act that Congress does. So that takes care of all the really early arrivals. Then Congress got busy and passed a couple of naturalization acts. First, the Naturalization Act for 1790 and 1795 provided a two-step process. It delegated authority over the process to a court of record being in parentheses because a court of record could be defined as being such a court if it had an official seal, if it had a court clerk to record proceedings, and it kept that written record of its proceedings. Well, fortunately and regretfully, a lot of courts fit that description. This means that a city court, a state district court, or a federal court could have handled a naturalization application prior to 1906. There really weren't any restrictions about which court you could use as long as it fit the definition of a court or record. As travel wasn't simple, people seeking to become U.S. citizens usually went to the closest court to them geographically. In Michigan, and throughout the Midwest really, most commonly used courts were the state district courts that were located in each county. Generally, each county seat had a courthouse run by the state judicial department, and that's where most people went. However, if you lived in a county boundary, let's say in Muskegon County, if you lived up in Montague, coming down to the city of Muskegon might have been a little bit of a drive, and maybe going up further to Oceana County or something might have been closer to you. It just depends on where you lived, and you just had to have residency in the state, not necessarily in the county where you file. In other parts of the country, across the U.S., especially along the East Coast, it was more common to use federal district courts that were arranged regionally throughout a state. Every county didn't have a federal district court, but they generally the federal court system would divide a state up into regions. Historically, Michigan had 4 federal district courts where naturalization records took place, and that would be Detroit, Flint, Grand Rapids, and Marquette. In the city of Detroit, they also had a recorder's court, and that handled naturalization as well. That court did as well. And there were other courts that could be used. There could be a city municipal court or even a smaller court of some sort, as long as it fit the definition of a court of record. The downside is, for these smaller courts, the records generally were not maintained or saved. So it might be kind of difficult to locate some naturalization records for a family member, depending on where they did it. It's just something to keep in mind while you're doing your search if you start having some real difficulty. And it is one of the reasons why, since they could go to any court around them, as long as it was within the state that they lived in, it can make it a little bit tricky to locate a set of court records. You may have to check the federal court in the area. You may have to check the county court. And then if you're in the Detroit area for the state of Michigan, you may have to check the Detroit Recorder's Court. You just never know where the records might be. Pre-1906, I always recommend starting with a county court, however. Now, the requirements for naturalization changed every time a new law was passed. From 1790 to 1798, the residency requirements were 5 years in the U.S., 1 year in the state where you were applying. This was to complete the process. You could start the process the minute you arrived in the United States, but to finish it, you had to have 5 years of residency in the U.S. and 1 year in the state. There was a brief period here, 1798 to 1802, a 5-year period where you had to live in the United States for 14 years and 5 years in your state before you could complete the process. Again, you could start it at any time, but to actually complete the process, do the second step of the process, you had to have this much longer residency rule, but this was for a very brief period of time, 5 years. From 1802 on, it was back to the 5-year, 1-year rule. But now you had to provide proof of that residency, which wasn't asked for before. There were also race requirements to begin the process of becoming a citizen in the United States. We discussed, of course, earlier that a blanket naturalization was given to all white adult males living in the U.S. when the Constitution was ratified and Congress started to set up the naturalization process. And then from 1790 to 1870, only free white persons, meaning white males aged 21 or older, who had arrived in the U.S., could apply for naturalization. So that means basically for the first 80 years, it was a white guy situation only in the U.S. Then in 1870, laws were passed to open up naturalization to persons of African nativity or African descent. And why do we think this is? That's right. 5 years earlier, the Civil War had ended. A couple of years before that, the Emancipation Proclamation had been passed, and there was no longer slavery in the United States. Now, the 14th Amendment that had been passed in 1868, It granted citizenship automatically to former slaves who were born in the U.S., but those who had come over as adults during this time frame had to apply for citizenship. But there were a couple of years there from 1868 to 1870 where there wasn't quite a process for them to do that. But as part of Reconstruction, those laws got passed, and those African Americans who had been brought over to the United States could now apply for citizenship as well. In 1882, the federal government passed a Chinese Exclusion Act, which did not allow anybody of Chinese descent to apply for citizenship in the United States, and this was not repealed until 1943. It's kind of mind-boggling to think that. And basically the reasoning behind this, or the historical background for this, is the country was expanding westward, the railroads were being built, and hundreds of thousands of Chinese nationals were being brought into the country to work as labor for the railroads, and not the best labor conditions. And of course, the railroad bosses had lots of political influence, and they didn't want the people they weren't perhaps treating so well having the right to vote and make laws about labor. So that's a little bit of background on why that act was in place. And then, of course, in 1924, finally, the federal government passed the Citizen Act that provided for all non-citizen Indians born in the U.S., including those born on reservations, were citizens. If you were born on a reservation prior to 1924, you were not considered a citizen of the United States. But that was remedied in 1924. Now, we talked about naturalization being a two-step process. Part of the challenge is the time frames. Step one was the Declaration of Intent. This was required from 1795 on. This filing required the immigrant to declare their intention to give up their allegiance to their country of origin and become a U.S. citizen. So that language, declare their intention, that you see there in quotations, that's actually on the documents. I think it's something like bona fide, their intention, and that they're going to give up their allegiance to their country of origin. And so thus this first step, this paperwork, starts to be called declarations of intent. And I share that with you because when you're looking for records, that's how the documents, the records may be labeled. A volume may be labeled declarations of intent for a certain time frame, so you know what it is that you're looking at. But it often was referred to informally as a first paper as well. This document could be filed upon arrival, but one could also wait. We talked about some time frames earlier, the 5-year, 1-year rule, 5 years in the U.S., 1 year in the state. That's to complete the process of becoming a citizen. For this declaration of intent, you could file it the minute you stepped off the boat or however else you entered into the country, or you could wait 25, 30 years, whatever. There wasn't a time frame for this to happen. So that's why it makes it a little tricky sometimes to locate this information. Sometimes they didn't file for a long time because they didn't see a reason to need to do so, and usually it's to buy land, because when the big land grants were opening up out west and the land acts were making land available to people who were willing to run out there and make improvements on it without much cost at a very low fee, one of the requirements was that you were either a citizen of the United States to get this land cheaply, or you were starting the process, which meant you had to show your declaration of intent. And that caused a lot of people to go down and start filing their declarations and get started on the process. The information that's asked on a declaration form, it varies from court to court. Remember, this is pre-1906. You have all these different courts, and they're all making their own forms. So you're going to just see different things all over the place, especially because the law only required that they asked for their name of the individual applying and the country of origin. That's very little information, and probably what most genealogy researchers already know when they start looking for citizenship papers. So sometimes, though, that might be pre-1906 the only information you find. But some courts got inventive, maybe wanted more identification to help identify the people applying. They might ask for a birth date, they might ask for a date of arrival or a port of entry, but it's going to vary greatly all over the board, and you just never know what's going to be on the form for your ancestor. Let's take a look at some examples. Here's a pre-1906 example from the county of Muskegon, the state of Michigan. This individual is completing this pre-printed form. It says, I, Ambrose Halverson, solemnly swear that it's bona fide my intention. There's that word that gets the title of the paperwork, the Declaration of Intent. Bona fide my intention to become a citizen of the United States and to renounce forever all allegiance and fidelity to the home country of origin. In this case, could be Norway, could be Sweden. The king was over both at the time. And then we get the date that it happened, 1859, in the county of Muskegon, and we have Ambrose's signature there. And that's one of the fun reasons to look for a pre-1906 declaration. If I'm making you think like, well, why would I look for this? There's not really anything on there. It's true. We just get Ambrose's name and we get his country of origin, but we get a signature. And that's kind of nice to see, a signature of a family member. So that's one reason why you might want to look for a pre-1906 naturalization record. Here's another sample from the court of Muskegon in the state of Michigan. This gentleman, his name is John Westerman. Again, he's solemnly swearing his bona fide intention, and he's giving up allegiance and renouncing to the King of Holland. So we know he's from Holland. And then down here we have, it says John Westerman, his mark, and this is June 3rd, 1875, and the clerk. I saved this form because of this mark situation here. Lots of immigrants coming over. For them, English was a second language. They weren't necessarily able to read and write it. So they were able and allowed to make their mark on the paperwork. And the clerk's signature below was the way the court recognized that the clerk witnessed the signature, the mark being made by this individual who was filing for citizenship. So it's kind of interesting there. On our previous one, we saw that Ambrose could read and write and sign his name in English. And in this one, Mr. Westerman does not. Finally, here's an interesting one from Minnesota, the state of Minnesota. This is from a district court in Norman County. This gentleman, Mr., and I might be pronouncing this wrong, and I apologize, but Stundal, I believe is his name, and he's in Norman County, and he is saying, that he was born in Norway. So now we know for sure that he's from Norway. On or about the year 1800, and it looks like 53 to me. Wow, we have a birth year, woohoo! He immigrated to the United States and landed at the port of New York on or about the month of May 1881. So now we have a port of entry and a date of entry. And then he gives up his allegiance to the King of Norway and Sweden, but in this case we know he's from Norway. And then we have his mark because Mr. Stundal also does, obviously perhaps is not literate in English. Well, that's fascinating. Here's a court in this pre-1906 time frame who's decided to get a little bit more information from the individuals coming in to apply for citizenship. We have a birth date, we have birth year. So if we're looking for birth records for this individual, we know where to start. We have a port of entry and a date of entry, which means we can look for immigration records, maybe find the name of a ship that he came over on. That's kind of fun. And so lots of good information there. This is another reason why you want to look for pre-1906 records, because you just never know if you're going to get lucky or not and find some interesting information. Now, just to confuse things, not everybody had to file a declaration of intent. From 1795 on, it was required with a few exceptions. And I can tell you for this session today, everything we're talking about today are the broad generalities. There are always going to be exceptions that you might come across when searching for naturalization records. It is one of the more challenging record groups to look for, but they can be very rewarding. For example, pre-1906, minors, men applying for citizenship after age 21, but who had arrived in the U.S. as a child, did not have to apply for citizenship, did not have to do a declaration of intent. They could go immediately to the second step. Now, this meant that their father more than likely did not apply for citizenship, and now that they had become grown men themselves, a little bit later in the process, they did want to become citizens of the United States. So they could skip the filing of the Declaration of Intent. So you wouldn't find one for them there. Widows, this is kind of interesting. Starting in 1804, an act was passed by Congress where a wife whose husband passed away before completing his citizenship process could use her husband's declaration and complete the process herself. Normally, in this time frame, wives and minor children automatically got their citizenship when the husband or father naturalized. But in the case of a widow, perhaps there's some issues about land ownership, or they want to add some land or buy some land to raise the family on or something. You really needed to be a citizen to do that, and there wasn't a way to start the process, but unless your husband had started it but didn't finish it. You could use their declaration. So that was a little window of opportunity there for women. And finally, military service would help you skip the declaration process and go right to the second step of filing the final paper. And this meant starting in 1862, aliens over the age of 21 who performed military service could become citizens after 1 year of residence in the United States. And that also meant basically also doing some military service as well. Now, why is this happening in 1862? You're exactly right. The Civil War is in its second year. The Union needs men to fill the ranks in the military. And so there are often military recruiters waiting at every boat coming into port along the eastern seacoast that was in the Union territory. And they would talk to men coming off the boat and say, hey, sign up right here, enlist in the military right now, and you're going to become a citizen in a year and get all rights and privileges thereof. So military service was also a quick way to become a citizen. Here's an example of a pre-1906 military record, and I apologize because this is not a very clear record. But we have an individual here by the name of Martin Heiser, and in this paragraph, he is saying that how long he's lived in the U.S. and everything. In this one, he's announcing his allegiance to his home country of Germany. And down here, this is where the final paper or the second step, they would talk about where the declaration was filed. Here it mentions that he enlisted in the military of the United States. He looks like he mustered out in 1862, but he enlisted in 1861. So he had his year of service in the military. And so he's able to skip that declaration. And this is his final paper where down here in the very last lines, they're granting him citizenship. So that's an example of a military citizenship application. Here is a sample of that widow situation that's so unusual. Back a few years ago, I was doing some research and I was looking for a naturalization record for a person by the name of Matt Wolty. And Matt Wolty started his process in St. Louis County, Minnesota. And they're asking for this. He's filing this in 1890. They're asking where he was born. We get a year of birth, 1866. He came in at the Port of New York in May of 1887. That's bona fide his intention to become a citizen of the United States and give up allegiance to Russia, because at that time, Russia was ruling Finland. And then we have a signature here, Matt Salty. So nice, normal, regular, pre-1906 declaration of intent. The court's asking a few more details that are helpful to us as researchers. We can look for a birth record in Finland in 1866. We can look for some immigration records in 1887 in the Port of New York. So that's kind of nice to see. But I could not find the final paper. I couldn't find anything for Matt. And I'm looking around in the volumes of documents, and I come across this final paper up here at the top, and it said, this is the application of Mary Wolty, wife of Matt Wolty. And we have two individuals vouching as witnesses for her character. And then Mary, once again, is renouncing her allegiance to her home country. And then down here, where it talks about where the declaration was filed, it says that Matt Wolty did before in 1890 filed his. So here's a situation where Mary's husband, Matt, had started the process, but something must have happened to him. So I did a little bit more searching, and sure enough, in some St. Louis County death record indexes, I came across, I have a little check mark here by Matt Wolty. He passed away in 1892. So 2 years after he started the process, he passed away, but he hadn't had time to finish it. And for some reason, Mary was finishing it. She probably maybe wanted to buy some land or add some land or something like that to where they were living, or maybe had children and wanted to get them naturalized as well. So this was a little window for a way that some women could go ahead and do that. So very interesting there. The petition or final paper, this is the second step in the process. The declaration of intent or first paper is the first step. And then step two, the final step, is called petition or final paper. In this pre-1906 time frame, almost everybody, including the courts, is referring to this as final papers, but you may see it listed as a petition as well. This has always been required. This final paper has always been required since 1790. It could not be filed before an immigrant had completed 5 years of residency in the U.S. and 1 year of residency in the state where filing. Now, remember, there was that brief period, that 5-year period from, what was it, 1798 to 1802, where it was 14 years and whatever, but they changed that. For the most part, it's always 5 years, 1 year. And that's the minimum amount of time you had to live in the U.S. before you could complete the process and file your final paper. However, you could do it much later than this, because there was no expiration on your declaration of intent. There was no time frame on when you had to finish the process. And so pre-1906, someone could do their declaration of intent in 1870 and finish their final paper in 1900. I mean, it's all over the board. And that does make it occasionally a little bit of a challenge when looking for naturalization records. Let's take a look at some examples. Oh, first of all, before we do that, starting in 1816, there were a few additions to the final paper, the final step. Two U.S. citizens had to swear to your residency and your character, and they had to be named in that petition. So you had to have 2 individuals vouch for you. And of course, once again, you have to renounce your allegiance to your country of origin. And no other personal information is provided right now, but the form does ask where the declaration was filed. So pre-1906, the declaration is still the paper you want to find the most, because the court may ask for some more information, like a birth year, birthplace, port of entry, date of entry. But the final paper does not add anything to that at all, but it will tell you where the declaration was filed. So that gives you a little tip that way if you come across a final paper first, which is kind of helpful. Now we're going to take a look at some examples. Remember, we saw John Westerman's Declaration of Intent from Muskegon County Court earlier in the presentation. Now we're looking at, back in the state of Michigan, the Court of Muskegon. And now we're in October of 1900. And the Judge Russell's there, and the matter of John Westerman, the applicant. He's a native of Holland. And it says here on June 3rd, 1875, he did file his intention to become a citizen. So that's where the Declaration of Intent is filed. So if we wanted to find it, and just in case Muskegon County was asking more information, remember we saw it, so we know they weren't, but just in case they were, this is where you'd look for it if you found the final paper first. And then it talks about his residency, 5 years within the state of Michigan, 1 in the country, 1 year in the state of Michigan, and that he has behaved as a man of good moral character. It's interesting, however, they don't list the witnesses' names here. It's kind of unusual. I don't see that very often. My guess is that maybe Muskegon County Court at this time frame of 1900 was keeping that witness paperwork like a separate sheet of paper or something, and it just didn't get microfilmed or something like that. But it's mentioning that the court has seen that he's been vouched for as someone of good character, and then he again renounces his allegiance to Holland and becomes a citizen of the United States. So that's the final paper. Again, the final paper does not have a great deal of information any beyond what we saw in the Declaration of Intent, but it does show that the citizenship process was completed and the individual became a citizen of the United States. Now, if you remember, we saw Mr. Stendhal's declaration also back earlier in the session when he was in Norman County, Minnesota. That was our first declaration where we saw them asking for some detailed information. We had gotten Mr. Stendhal's birth date and his port of entry, date of entry. Well, here's his final paper in that same court. And right up front here in the top in this court, because remember, every court could make their own forms. There wasn't any standardization or anything. Here the witnesses are listed. This Ellingflower and Ole Nielsen are listed as saying that Mr. Stendhal is of good character. So that's good. Once again, he's renouncing his allegiance to the King of Norway and Sweden. And then down here, he is said that he filed his Declaration of Intent before and becoming a citizen of the United States. So here's the final paper, and now Mr. Stendhal, whose paper we saw earlier, is now a citizen of the United States. So that's a nice complete record, pre-1906 record right there. Now, I do want you to pay attention to the names of the witnesses here for Mr. Stendhal. Let's see, Ellingflower and Ole Nielsen. And then we're looking at our date of, when did we do this? It looks about 18, I think it's either 86 or 96. So I want to take a look at this next record. This happened to be in the volume next to Mr. Stendhal's. Same court, Norman County, Minnesota. We have a Samuel Olson who's finishing the process. Oh, and look at his witnesses of his character. It's Ole Nielsen and Elling Flower again, those same two gentlemen we had just seen in Mr. Stundall's final paper. This is kind of funny to see. And it just kind of shows that there were probably court watchers. Lots of people hung out at the courthouse at this time frame. It was the hub of the community. Lots of things were happening then. And professional court watchers may have become professional witnesses. Again, remember, applicants for naturalization, for citizenship, for them, English is a second language. This is a new country with new procedures and all this paperwork, and they might show up at court without realizing they had to have two witnesses with them to vouch for their character. And so there would be professional witnesses at the courthouse who maybe for some kind of barter or maybe even for a small payment would be your professional witness. But it also left a lot of room for fraud as well. So just something to keep in mind when you see that. Just kind of fun to see. Also, the confusion about this being that they're not realizing that they needed witnesses, there was a lot of confusion about the process. A lot of times people thought the Declaration of Intent was all that was needed, that once they did that, they had become citizens, particularly those who were moving out west to become landowners under the Land Acts, because that was all that was required by the government. You didn't have to finish the process of the citizenship, although technically they were assuming you were going to, but you at least had to show them a Declaration of Intent so you qualified to buy land under the inexpensive costs that were set up under the Land Acts. And so a lot of people did their Declaration of Intent and never finished. They thought they were done, and they might even vote. They might do anything that a citizen would do because they thought they were done. It was an honest mistake, just not understanding the process. Here's a great example of that found in a record post 1906. This is a 1915 record, but this individual is doing his petition, his final paper, and this nice typewritten statement here talks about how he had been arrived in this country at the age of 5. His father had applied for citizenship, had begun voting and everything, and had done his Declaration of Intent and thought he was a citizen. And this gentleman had been acting as a citizen all along, as he thought he was a citizen as well. Something must have come up where he needed to show his citizenship papers. And he talked about his father, and they had to find his father's and realized, oh, he never finished the process, and now he has to finish the process. And he's doing his final paper here. So it's just kind of an interesting example of the confusion that can happen in the process. Now, a document that comes out at the end of the process, they filed their Declaration of Intent, they've done at least the minimum of the 5 years in the country, 1 year in the state where they're finishing up, although it can be a lot longer than that. They're going to get a certificate of citizenship from the court when they're finished. And this is the document that a lot of family genealogy researchers come across in their own personal papers. And they think, oh, look, I have the citizenship record. But there's not a great deal of information on this. We get a date, we get the individual's name, and we get the fact that they've become a citizen of the United States, and then the court signature and the court seal. So while this is proof, definite original proof that someone became a citizen of the United States, what's helpful about this document is that you know what court it occurred in. This is, again, Norman County District Court, state of Minnesota, so you know where to go to look for those paperwork that is actually the application or true naturalization record. But this is a value. It is the certificate of citizenship, but it's not the naturalization record. It's just a certificate of citizenship. And they're often not found in the court records. This one it was, but often the court did not always keep a copy. They just gave a copy to the newly minted citizen, and they didn't necessarily keep the record themselves in their documentation. So it's useful information to find. It does give you a good starting point to look for at least the final paper or petition, but it is not a naturalization record. It is a certificate of citizenship. Women in naturalization have had a very interesting history. And pre-1906, normally, again, like I mentioned, a wife and children got their citizenship automatically via when their spouse or father naturalized. So there's not going to be any paperwork. Up to 1922, it's really, really rare to find any kind of naturalization paperwork for a single woman. You're not going to find anything for a married woman because her husband's going to do it, but normally. But single women are as rare as unicorns in this time frame for a couple of reasons. First of all, up to 1922, no women are voting, so there's no push or interest to become a citizen in order to have the right to vote. There were application fees that varied from court to court. Remember, these courts, all these different courts of records are doing it, and they can set their own rules. So an application fee might be prohibitive for a single woman who didn't have an income to depend on besides her own, and her own was more than likely markedly less than what a man might be making at the same time. And also, the usual reason to apply for naturalization in the pre-1906 period is to own land. That was the big push to do it. Voting was not as strong a reason as you might think, even among men, but the to own land was a big push, and that's why you might come across the rare, unusual single woman to own property. And we're going to take a look at one sample here. Here's one of those rare women. This young lady by the name of Emma Sutherland. She's in the county of Hennepin, state of Minnesota. Hennepin County is where the city of Minneapolis is located. And she's declared that she arrived in the United States on the 18th of December in the year 1871. So we have an arrival date. That's nice. We don't have a location. We don't have a port of entry, but we have an arrival date. That's helpful. And it's bona fide her intention to become a citizen of the United States and give up her allegiance to the King of Norway and Sweden. Now, we don't have any birth information, so we don't know if she's actually from Sweden or Norway, but we know that what year she arrived, so we can start to look for some information. And we have the signature of our relative. So that's what's kind of nice to find in this pre-1906 rare woman's naturalization record that you might come across. Now, we're going to move into post-1906 naturalization. This is where things get interesting for genealogists. On June 29, 1906, Congress passed another sweeping Naturalization Act. This was a really large, involved act that really set up the system almost as we know it today. It combines the immigration and naturalization functions of the federal government into the INS, the Bureau of Immigration and Naturalization. The federal courts now are the ones responsible for naturalization, the only ones responsible for naturalization. This means the federal government is taking over the responsibility for granting citizenship. Now it's not just any court of record, it must be a federal court. Now, while this passed in 1906, you're going to see lots of court records still in the county courts for a few years beyond that, because it took a long time for those lower courts who'd been so used to doing it to give up the practice. The really good news for genealogists is that the application forms now become standardized, and they now require detailed identifying information from each individual applicant. Very exciting news. The process, however, is still going to require 2 steps. Once again, the declaration of intent is the first step. But now that form is going to ask for a lot of information: a date of birth, a place of birth, a physical description, the last foreign residence where they lived, the date of immigration, the port of entry, and the name of the ship. This is the gold standard of a naturalization record that genealogists are looking for, because what genealogists want to find on citizenship records is that home location in the country of origin. Lots of us know that our great-grandparents, or our ancestors even farther back than that, came from Sweden, Norway, Ireland, Germany, France, all over the place. We know that, but we don't know where in those countries, and that's what we want to find out. So now we're going to start seeing some good information on these post-1906 declarations of intent. And every court processing naturalization applications, so even though those lower courts that weren't giving up the process yet, they had to start using these new forms by September 27, 1906. So now, from this point on, September 27th, all these forms are going to look exactly the same and ask the same information. They also have expiration dates on these declarations of intent now that we're post-1906. They're going to expire after 7 years. So once you find one, you know that with that 5-year, 1-year rule, they're going to have to do that final paper fairly close to the declaration of intent. So it's going to be pretty much easier to find them. And the declaration of intent has to be on file for at least 2 years before you file the petition. So it helps you narrow it down there. And after 1929, you start seeing some photographs attached to declaration forms as well, and that's kind of fun to see. So now we have some expiration dates for these documents so that once you find one, it's easier to find the other. You still don't have to, there's still no time frame quite yet in this time frame that we're looking at in these historical naturalization records where you don't have to file, it's not required that you become a citizen of the United States. Of course, now in the late 20th century, we started having rules about how long you could stay in the United States without doing some paperwork with the federal government. But in these early years, this early 20th century, there's not really a time frame. So this expiration dates and things helps narrow down your search a little bit when you're looking for records. So here's our first example of a post-1906 record. It's a declaration of intent in the U.S. District Court, Western District of Michigan. Remember, we had to do federal courts now. And this is for a gentleman, looks like it's Roland, I think it's Beams, something like that. He's 31 years old. He's a cabinet maker. His race is white. His complexion is dark. He's 5'8" tall, 168 pounds. Color of his hair is black. Color of his eyes are brown. He doesn't have any distinctive marks. Looks like he was born in, I'm trying to read the handwriting, I think it's going to be Hamstad, the Netherlands, on the 26th day of March, 1880. Holy cow, got a birth date. And he immigrated to the United States from the Netherlands on the vessel Wassland, and his last foreign residence was Hamstad, so he was staying in that hometown where he was born. And it's now bona fide his intention, so we still have that language there about declaring your intent to become a citizen. And he arrived in the port of New York on or about it says unknown day of August in 1881. He doesn't exactly remember because he came in 1881 or 91, and he's doing this form in 1911. Remember when I said just because your family member came over pre-1906, don't despair that you might not have a post-1906 naturalization record with all of this great information, because see, this gentleman waited that long. So it just goes to show you, you never know. But here we have, oh my gosh, now we even know what he looks like. He's 5'8" tall, he weighs 168 pounds, he has black hair, brown eyes. We know where he was born, his date of birth, all this great information that sends us on our way to look for more detailed information about our family members. And we know the community and where he was born in the Netherlands. So if we want to make a trip to that home country of our ancestors, we can go right to that home community and be in the town where our ancestor was born, which is one of the great things about finding naturalization records. Here's another one. Remember I talked about in later years, we even start seeing photographs. Here's another declaration of intent record filed in the Eastern District of Michigan Federal Court, Southern Division. And this is for a gentleman named, it looks like Elias Divitoros, and he was living in Detroit. And all of the information there of his arrival actually mentions children's names that were born. This is a few years later. Let's see, what is the date on this document here? I want to say it's definitely, so you can see also by the typing as well, we start seeing those kinds of documentations happening, but it's definitely later, after the late 1920s or so, because we have the photograph and we're getting lots more information being asked on the declarations of intent, including children's names. And that's just what happens because there's naturalization laws enacted all the time that are constantly revamping and working out details on things that are supposed to happen in the naturalization process. So we get a nice photograph here to see this gentleman's, what this ancestor looked like when he was applying for citizenship. Now, step 2 also still has to occur. Remember, pre-1906, we really commonly called it a final paper, even though it's also known as a petition. But now, post-1906, in the world where the federal courts are doing all the naturalization processes, it's now known as a petition and record. Still requires that 5-year residency in the U.S., 1 year in the state, but can't be filled until 2 years after the declaration. So we're really going to be able to narrow down when we're looking for records, a time frame for when our person may start and finish the process. And the declaration now expires in 7 years, so we're not going to see such a long wait between steps of the process. And a duplicate copy of the declaration is now filed with the petition. So if you locate the petition and record first, maybe looking at an index, you don't even need to look for the declaration because a duplicate copy of it is filed with the petition. So that's a nice step to save you some time. You can just start looking for the petitions and records, and you don't need to look for a declaration either. Now, something else that starts happening, starting in 1903, they had to have a certificate of arrival that was created, and that was to be kept with the petition. And that certificate of arrival provided the ship's name, the date of arrival, and the port of entry. So even though it's asked on the Declaration of Intent, starting in 1906, if you get somebody who arrived in 1903 or later, you might also have a certificate of arrival. And it's just a nice little bit of extra bit of information about when they arrived. And now the petition form, the duplicate Declaration of Intent form, and the certificate of arrival all together create what's known as the naturalization record. So when you're looking for documents either on indexes online on genealogy sites, or you're looking in microfilm at a state historical society or something, and you see a record group that's labeled petition and record, that means that all three pieces of documentation should be there for any individuals included in those records. There should be a duplicate Declaration of Intent, a certificate of arrival, and the final petition should all be there in one record group. Let's take a look at what a complete naturalization petition and record would look like post-1906. So here's a record for an individual by the name of George McParland or McFarland, one or the other. Looks like McParland the way he signs it down here. And he is, we get the physical description of him. He was born in Port Arthur, Canada in 1890, it looks like. He immigrated in 1925 no, he was married, excuse me, I apologize. He's married in 1925. He has a child here. They're asking that information on this naturalization form. And then we have where he immigrated. He came over, he was born in Port Arthur, Canada, and he came through Windsor to Detroit. So that's how he arrived in the United States. So this is his copy of the declaration with his photo on it. So you could find this declaration in a volume of declarations as well. But the copy is with the petition and record, the full record, so you don't need to look for it if you find the petition and record. Then we have our certificate of arrival that's been required since 1903, and it's a certificate of arrival from the Immigration Service, Port of Entry, Detroit, Michigan, his name, his date of arrival, December 19th, 1923, and arriving on the D&W ferry. So there we have a certificate of arrival that was created. And then here's the final petition for naturalization for Mr. McParland. And we have his address where he was living in Detroit at this time. And his child, that information is repeated there again, where he came through in Detroit. And then on the back here, we have the affidavit of the witnesses that were saying that they were vouching for him, and they have to give their addresses and everything as well. And then down here, the inspector who vouches. At this point in time, they are checking that the witnesses really do know the individual. And then in this section down here, the oath of allegiance is done, and citizenship is granted by the court. So that's what a final full petition and record would look like post-1906. Now, remember we talked about the unusual situation women had with naturalization pre-1906. It gets even a little bit stranger post-1906 for a little while. Starting in 1907, Congress passed an Expatriation Act. Any alien woman who married a native-born or naturalized U.S. citizen became a citizen automatically. So if you came over from another country and you married a native-born U.S. citizen, or you married someone else from your own country, but they'd gone through the citizenship process, you became a citizen automatically. Pretty simple. Get married, become a citizen. But any female U.S. citizen, native-born in the United States, who married an alien, got the reverse. They lost their citizenship. You actually lost your citizenship if you married an alien. Now, you would regain it again if the alien you married became a citizen himself just through marriage, but you lost it on your own. Now, this law was repealed in 1922, but you couldn't do anything about it if you had married somebody before 1922 until finally in 1936 and in 1940, there were laws passed that provided a process that allowed you to regain citizenship. And finally, the 1940 Act passed that allowed for all women who had lost citizenship could repatriate regardless of marriage status. So, and if you were trying to get your marriage, your U.S. citizen status back after marrying an alien, and let's say the alien had applied for citizenship and was refused for whatever reason, couldn't find people to vouch for him or whatever, you couldn't apply for it either, even though you were a native-born U.S. woman and you'd lost your citizenship only by getting married. So 1940 law took care of that. The 1940 Act was the one that said it didn't matter what your marriage status was, and if you'd lost citizenship, you could apply for it again. So that 1922 Married Women's Act was an important one. That act of marriage no longer granted or removed citizenship. Took away that whole thing. Now everybody on their own, male or female, has to apply for citizenship. And they had to be over the age of 21. Then you had to apply on your own. Didn't matter if you married, if you both came over as aliens and then you got married and your husband applied, you wouldn't get it after 1922. You had to apply for it on your own now if you wanted it. And why would you want it? That's right. The woman's right to vote was granted in 1920, 100 years ago. So citizenship was now something a lot of women wanted to have in order to be able to vote. And so just kind of an interesting review of how women were treated with naturalization. And let's take a couple of examples here. Here is a post-1906, but before 1922, declaration of intent of an individual woman applying. She's a single woman. She's not married or anything. And telling her where she's coming from, gives a thorough description, how much she weighs and all that type of thing, and her signature. So that's an example of a single woman prior to 1922 applying for citizenship. And she's not married, so she's not going to get it through her spouse or anything. Then here's another one. Now this one's applying in 1927. And I happen to know that there is a document for her husband, but it's 1927, so she has to apply for herself. And we get her physical description and everything. But what's kind of nice here is we get the name of her husband, Peter. He was born at Palermo in Italy. And so we get some information about him as well. If you haven't found anything for this family member before, now you've got a little extra information in the documentation, the Declaration of Intent for Frances Licari, if she happened to be a family member, if someone was looking for. So kind of interesting there, get a little bit more detail. Now, here's one of those examples of the repatriation application we talked about. This is someone who got married prior to 1922 and lost her, and after 1906, so she lost her citizenship, even though she was born in the United States, and then her spouse died. So she's applying for repatriation. Her name is Mary Rose. She's living in Faribault, Minnesota. We get a birth date of 1884, a marriage date of 1916. She married Peter Strzelecka, who was then an alien from Poland. And then my marital status with the alien terminated in 1930 because of his death. And then all the documentation she provided to prove all this, her birth date, her birth certificate, her marriage certificate, his death certificate, and then they re-grant her citizenship back as a citizen of the United States, even though she was naturally born, because this is 1939, and she needs to do so. She didn't because she married before 1922. So just kind of an interesting situation there. Now we're going to talk about search strategies for naturalization records. For researching in pre-1906 records, the best rule to remember is there is no rule. You just have to keep that in mind. Remember, any court could do it. There's approximately 5,000 courts handling naturalization records throughout the country, throughout the United States, from 1795 to 1906. A lot of room for fraud, a lot of room for mistakes, a lot of room for error. So you have to keep that in mind. And also keep in mind that none of this documentation was ever intended to be a genealogical record. So as frustrated that you might be that one county for one family member in one state asked for a birth date and everything, and one in another state did not, it just was the whim of the county, and who knows why they were asking for that information. They weren't asking for it so that it could be a genealogical record in the 21st century. So it's good to keep that in mind. Some more search strategies to keep in mind. Pre-1906, remember the bulk of the naturalizations are being handled by the state district courts located in each county. Might be a little different along the East Coast, might be more federal courts happening there because they were established earlier, because they were populated earlier, but the bulk of naturalizations were being handled by state district courts located in each county within a state. So that's where you want to look for. You want to find out where are those state district court naturalization records being held. Few of these records are digitized, sad to say. Usually available via microfilm. Usually a state or local historical society will have the microfilm, or a local public library or state library will have the microfilm of the records. You just have to do a little digging sometimes to find out where they might be. For example, here in Muskegon, the Hackley Public Library has the Muskegon County District Court naturalization records from 1859 through 1906 available to use on microfilm. So that's one location right here in Muskegon County where you can find naturalization records for any family members who may have done it here in Muskegon County, pre-1906. Now, post-1906, now we know, if we remember, only the federal courts are supposed to be handling the records, but early years may still be found in some of those state district courts, but they're all going to be using that same standardized form. Genealogy websites often have lots of indexes for the federal court records and some digitized images, but there's more indexes, which is helpful because it helps you figure out what the record is and if it exists, but you might not always see the digitized image of the record itself. What do you do then? If you find a name in an index for a federal court record and there's not a digitized record available, and maybe there's no, maybe your state or state archives or state historical society is far away from you or something like that, you can contact the U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services for a copy of the record itself. You can go on their website. I'm giving you the web address here. And they have a little process there to follow. It is expensive. I'm not going to lie to you. It's expensive to get a copy of the record from the U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services. But it is, though, if you can find them in an index, or you know for sure that they naturalized and you can't find them anywhere, this might be a last resort to look for a citizenship naturalization record for an individual. You can also look at the National Archives. They have regional research centers throughout the United States. The closest one that covers the Midwest is in Chicago, and they have a lot of federal court records on microfilm. So that's a place that you definitely might want to search, and they always have, on their websites, they often have some indexing available, and that's available just by searching National Archives regional research centers on Google. But the genealogy mega sites that we're going to look at also have most of those digitized indexes that the National Archives have. So searching for naturalizations online are going to be the next step we're going to take. Remember again that a few collections of naturalization records have been digitized, but not all. We are going to take a look at Ancestry Library Edition, though, and MyHeritage Library Edition, because they are good starting points. General information about using these two sites and how to access these two resources from home were covered in the June 2020 RootTALK session that's titled Getting Started in Family History, and you can view that session on the MADL YouTube channel. But let's get started ourselves with Ancestry Library Edition. So here we are on Ancestry Library Edition's homepage. To get started looking for naturalization records, you have a couple of different options. If you scroll down to the bottom of the page, in one of their highlighted boxes, they have a search immigration option, and if you click on that button here for search now, it will take you to a search template that will search every single immigration and naturalization record that Ancestry has. It's certainly one way to start the searching, but I always recommend to start a little bit more specifically and then work more broadly. So I wouldn't start with this option, but it's certainly available to you. Another option is to go up under the search button here, and there's an option for immigration and travel as well. And if you click on that link. It gives you, again, the same search template to search all the different naturalization and immigration records that Ancestry might hold. Now over here you can limit even by category, and if you choose the citizenship and naturalization records option, you can see that it's not just United States records, but there's records from all over the country. So again, you certainly can search in this category. It certainly might be a helpful way to start, especially if you want to limit just to USA, to search for people all over the country, because as we've seen, even within a state or possible series of states that relatives might have lived in, there's a whole variety of locations that they could have filed their naturalization record at. But I do recommend starting a little bit even more specifically than that. So if we go back to the home page, we pull down the search menu and choose the card catalog. In this option, we can search for specific databases within Ancestry. So if I type in Michigan naturalization, because I'm looking for somebody who lived in Michigan at the time I believe they naturalized, and hit the search button, I'm going to get a list of just 14 databases that in some way contains Michigan naturalization records. And if I scroll up and down the page, I can see the different listings that there are. Here's some indexes that could be interesting. Here's some World War I soldier naturalizations. That looks interesting as well. But here's some federal naturalization records from 1887 to 1931, covering Michigan federal courts. I think I'm going to start with that one. So I'll click on that database title, and up comes a page that tells me what record group I'm in, and it gives me a search template. And now I know that I'm only searching Michigan, state of Michigan federal court records. So I'm going to search for a person by the name of Herman Lahan, and that's all I'm going to put in, because I'm not 100% sure any of these other pieces of information here that the template's asking for. If you scroll down the template, though, if you do have information, if you have a certificate of citizenship number, you can put those things in. If you have a declaration number, you can put that number in and search that way too, which is quite nice. But I'm starting from scratch. I don't have anything for Herman Lahan, so I'm going to hit the search button. And up comes a link for a Herman Lahan for a declaration, a Herman Frederick Lahan for an oath, and a Herman Frederick Lahan for a petition. This looks interesting. I'm going to start with the declaration, the first record. And up here I get a little bit of the transcription of the information, but I can view the actual record. These records have been digitized. So I'm going to hit the view button. And up comes, I can see the declaration of intent, but it looks like it's in front of another record. So if I put it down, I see it's in front of the petition. This looks like it might be a complete set of records for Herman Lahan. As I go up here at the top of the page, I see that I am looking at naturalization, petitions, and records. So that means I'm going to see the whole complete record set right here for Mr. Lahan. So I'm going to pull up that declaration of intent screen, enlarge it a little bit, and we'll see that Herman Lahan filed this declaration of intent in Kent County Circuit Court. He was 35 years old. His occupation was a clerk. He's white. His complexion was fair. He's height 5 foot 8 inches, 140 pounds, brown hair, brown eyes, no distinctive marks. He was born in Bad Bramstedt, Germany on the first day of October 1888. Now lives on Granville in Grand Rapids. He immigrated from America from Potosi, Bolivia on the vessel Heredia. His last foreign residence was Potosi, Bolivia. He's not married. He's giving up his allegiance to the German Empire. And it says that he arrived at the port of New Orleans, the state of Louisiana, on or about the 7th day of January, 1916. And there's his declaration of intent. So I'm not going to go back and look at those other links because I see the record is right here. I'm just going to click on the arrow right over here to the side. And that's going to flip the page, move the declaration of intent, and now I'm looking at the petition for naturalization for Herman Lahan. Now it's Herman Frederick Lahan. He's living on Granville. He's a clerk. He's born October 1st, 1888 in Germany. And this now says that he immigrated from Colonial, Panama. And remember, the other one was from Bolivia. My guess is that the ship went from Bolivia to Panama and then from Panama into New Orleans because it's still the Heredia. So they have to go from the last port of entry. And we get the information. He's on Granville Avenue. He's giving up his loyalty to the German Reich. Oh, if I go back up here, it looks like now he's married. His wife's name is Emma, and we get her birth date. So lots of great information here in this naturalization record for genealogy purposes. And he says how long he resided in the state of Michigan and signs. And then down here at the bottom, he has 2 witnesses. One's a manager and one's a foreman, giving their addresses, who are vouching for his character. And then if we go to the next page, up at the top of the page, we have Mr. Lehane signing his oath of allegiance, that he's giving up and renouncing his allegiance to any other foreign entities other than the United States. And then down here, if they become a citizen, you'll get the citizenship number. It's a Certificate of Naturalization 2617288 on December 19th, 1927. So he did go through the whole process. So here's my whole record that I was looking for. I just go back a few pages and I can see the petition, and back one more page, and I can see the Declaration of Intent. So very interesting information here for Herman Lehane. And let's say I want to keep this record for my genealogy purposes. Over here under our little cross toolbar sign, if we click on that, we can print the record if we have a printer at home, or if we're looking at this at the library. We can download the record and share it to our save it to a USB drive or our desktop. All sorts of options here. Or we can go right up here to the save option right in the green up top, click on that, and we can send the image home by putting in an email address, or we can save to this computer and save it to the computer I'm working on. So if I was working on my own laptop at home, I could save it right to my files. So that's the quick and easy way to find and look for Michigan naturalization records on Ancestry. But again, you can always use the option of going to the search button and choosing all the immigration records, or you can go back into the catalog and even search and see what they might have for another state. So like if we put in Wisconsin naturalization, and let's see, when we're looking at the whole card catalog, right now there's about 10,500 and some different databases. But if we search for Wisconsin naturalization, we get about 12 matches. Here's federal records again, some other interesting indexes and things, World War I records as well. But again, I'd want to start maybe with those federal naturalization records and see what I can find. But what we don't see here are the local county records. And that's what I was saying, that in those cases, you may end up contacting a state historical society or state library or local library for the county where you think your person may have done their naturalization record if you don't find them in the federal records. And that's how we look for naturalization on Ancestry Library Edition. Okay, here we are on the MyHeritage Library Edition homepage. And before we get started with what MyHeritage has for naturalization records, I did want to share with you that MyHeritage does not have anywhere near the depth of the collection of naturalization records that Ancestry Library Edition does. And pretty much everything that MyHeritage does have for naturalization are indexes to naturalization records. But these can still be of value because it can tell you possibly where the naturalization records themselves might exist if you find a name in the index that might be somebody you're looking for. So it's always good to search a record group whether you're successful or not. You never know what you might come across. But I will say that Ancestry Library Edition does have the most in-depth collection of digitized federal naturalization records. Having said that, let's take a look at what MyHeritage has to offer. Over here on the right-hand side under Categories is where MyHeritage lists all the record groups they have. We see here census and voter lists. We see family trees, birth, marriage, and death. And down here is immigration and travel, and the third item there is citizenship, passport, and naturalization records. So let's click on that. And when that comes up, we see over here again on the right, we get a list of all the record groups in that collection. And as you can see as we scroll down, it's not very big. It looks about 9 different record groups coming up. This first one, this U.S. Naturalization Records Group, 4 million records, that looks kind of interesting. Let's click on that and see what the description is. When we choose a record group, we then go to the page. At the top of the page, we get a description of that group. And it tells us here, if we click on the pull-down arrow, that this collection combines more than a dozen NARA data sets of naturalization records from several different U.S. jurisdictions, and they mean court jurisdictions. And so these are the indexes to those records. And it's California, it's World War I soldiers, it's Maryland, Pennsylvania, New York City, so kind of a different variety of record groups. And when it talks about NARA, NARA is the acronym for the National Archives and Record Administration Center. And so that means that these records would be held at the regional research centers for these states. So if you did find somebody in this record group, then you would want to find out what regional research center is that state in, and then look at the website, do a Google search for Regional Research Center, NARA, N-A-R-A, and see how you go about requesting naturalization records from them. Now, I can tell you, if you remember in the presentation, I mentioned that the National Archives Regional Research Center for Michigan is in Chicago. So let's go back again to the complete record group for naturalization records. And as we scroll down the list here, we see that there are a record index for Northern Illinois, for New England, Northern California, Northern District of Illinois again, Ohio, Minnesota, and West Virginia. So a pretty small eclectic group of records. But if one of these communities was of interest to you, it could be valuable. Let's take a look and see what Minnesota looks like. So I'm choosing the Minnesota Naturalization Card Index, 1930 to 1988. So important to realize that that time frame is pretty recent, but maybe you have somebody who fits in. And it tells us that this collection contains 2 naturalization card indexes from the District Court of Minnesota, 3rd and 4th Division, captured at the NARA facility in Chicago. And so what that's telling me is if I find somebody in this index I'm interested in, the naturalization record itself will be at the Regional Research Center in Chicago. So worth taking a look at. Let's do a search. Let's try the name. I don't know. Let's try Otto Larson. Say I'm looking for somebody with that name. And I'm not going to put anything else in because I'm not sure. And I'll click on the search button. And I get 3 results that come up. I have an Otto Larson and 2 other Otto Larsons with a middle name of Yalmus, it looks like. Well, let's say I'm interested in the first one. So I click on that name link, and up comes a page, and we get some brief information transcribed from the index card. But if we scroll down, we see the index card itself in its entirety. It tells me Otto Larson's name, that is residing at Park Avenue, his date of birth, the date the certificate was issued, and which court, and a petition number. So if this happened to be my person, if that Otto Larson, who was born on February 5th, 1899, was somebody whose naturalization record I was looking for, I now have a petition number. Now I could Google NARA, Regional Research Center, Chicago, look at the website and see how I go about requesting a naturalization record when I know a petition number. And let's say I wanted to keep this, an image of this card, so I would keep all the other information that might be there that might be helpful. If you right click on the card, you can copy the image and then paste it like in another file, or you can save the image itself as a JPEG or a PDF document, or you can email the image. So those are your options there for saving the information from My Heritage Library Edition. So that's one way how you can use these indexes for naturalization records in My Heritage Library Edition. So as I mentioned, not as deep a collection as Ancestry Library Edition, but all good genealogists never want to overlook a search location where they might find some information for the person they're looking for. Thank you so much for joining this MADL RootTALK session on U.S. naturalization records, and we hope you enjoyed the presentation. Don't forget to like our Facebook page and subscribe to our YouTube channel to access all of our virtual programming. The Muskegon Area District Library serves the community with 10 local branches, and we're open 24/7 with access to many digital resources. Please visit madl.org for more information.